The scent of sizzling ribs and seasoned chicken filled the warm summer air, mixing with the tangy aroma of barbecue sauce and grilled corn. Children laughed and chased each other across the lush green lawn, their bare feet kicking up soft patches of dirt. The music pulsed from a portable speaker, a rhythmic heartbeat to the gathering of friends and family who had come together to celebrate a birthday, a milestone, and simply life itself. For the Johnsons, this barbecue was more than just a gathering, it was a tradition. Every summer, they fired up the grill, invited their closest friends and family, and made memories that would be passed down for generations. Isaiah Johnson, a sturdy man in his mid-40s with deep brown skin and a booming laugh, stood over the grill, flipping thick slabs of ribs with the precision of a master chef. His wife, Camille, a woman with soft curls and a bright, infectious smile, moved between guests, making sure everyone had a plate piled high with food. The Johnsons had only lived in Maplewood for 3 years, but in that time, they had built a life they were proud of. Their home, a charming brick colonial with a wraparound porch, was their dream. The community, however, had been slow to embrace them. Most of the neighbors kept their distance, their smiles polite but strained. And then there was Margaret Whitmore. Margaret had lived in Maplewood for over 30 years, and to her, the neighborhood belonged to people like her, people who had built their lives here, long before outsiders moved in. She watched the Johnsons barbecue from her bay window, her lips pursed in a tight line. The music, the laughter, the smoke curling into the sky, it was all too much. She picked up her phone and dialed 911. "What's your emergency?" Margaret's voice was calm, but firm. "Yes, I'd like to report a disturbance. There's a large group of people loitering in my neighborhood. They don't belong here." The dispatcher hesitated. "Ma'am, what exactly is the disturbance?" "They're being loud, playing music, and I think I smell something illegal." The dispatcher sighed but followed protocol. "We'll send an officer to check it out." Margaret hung up, her eyes narrowing as she watched the Johnsons laugh and celebrate. She muttered under her breath, "This isn't your neighborhood." 15 minutes later, the celebration was interrupted by the sharp wail of police sirens. 3 squad cars pulled up along the curb, their red and blue lights flashing against the setting sun. The music cut off, and conversations halted as officers stepped out of their vehicles. The mood of the barbecue shifted in an instant. Isaiah wiped his hands on his apron and stepped forward, his heart pounding. Camille reached for his arm, her fingers tight around his wrist. "Stay calm," she whispered. A tall officer with short cropped blonde hair and mirrored sunglasses approached. His name tag read Officer Daniels. Camille no longer waved at neighbors, no longer offered polite smiles at the grocery store, and Isaiah, usually a man of humor and ease, carried a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. But if the Johnsons felt the weight of what had happened, Margaret Whitmore felt something else entirely. Vindication. To her, the problem had been addressed, a warning had been given. She expected the Johnsons to take the hint, to become more invisible. That was how things had always worked in Maplewood. If someone didn't belong, they faded away on their own. But the Johnsons did not fade, and that was a problem. A month later, on an unusually cool Saturday morning, Camille stood on the porch sipping her coffee when she spotted Margaret across the street, standing on her perfectly manicured lawn, chatting with 2 other neighbors. Their eyes flickered toward Camille, lips pursed, voices hushed. Camille took a slow sip and held their gaze. They looked away first. Isaiah emerged from the house, his car keys jingling in his palm. "Grocery run," he said. "You need anything?" Camille smiled. "Just bring me back some peace and quiet." He chuckled and kissed her cheek before heading down the driveway. Across the street, Margaret watched Isaiah leave, her lips curling in thought. It was an hour later when Camille heard the knock. It wasn't friendly. It was sharp, demanding. She opened the door to find a man standing on her porch, tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a smug expression beneath his police uniform. Not Officer Daniels this time. This one was different. His badge read Lieutenant Rourke. "Ma'am," he greeted, tipping his head. "Got a report of an abandoned vehicle out front." Camille blinked. "Excuse me." Rourke nodded toward the driveway. "That one right there." Camille followed his gaze to Isaiah's truck, parked neatly as always. Her confusion turned to irritation. "That's my husband's truck," she said, arms crossing, "and it's parked in our driveway. So, no, it's not abandoned." Rourke sighed, the kind of sigh that said he had expected this response. "Ma'am, we got a complaint. We have to check it out." Camille's fingers twitched. She knew exactly where this complaint had come from. "Who called it in?" Rourke smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "That's confidential." Camille let out a slow breath, keeping her temper in check. "So, let me get this straight," she said, voice even. "Someone called in a complaint about a truck that is clearly parked in a private driveway, and instead of dismissing it as ridiculous, you actually came out here." Rourke shrugged. "Just doing my job." Camille tilted her head. "Your job, right. Your job wouldn't have anything to do with the fact that my family had a run-in with your officers last month, would it?" Something flickered across Rourke's face, but it was gone before she could place it. "Just making sure everything is in order." Camille held his gaze. "It is." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Rourke tipped his head again. "Good day, ma'am." He turned and walked back to his squad car, driving off as if he hadn't just delivered a message in broad daylight. Camille closed the door, her breath coming fast. Her hands trembled with rage. She turned, eyes scanning the living room where family photos hung along the walls, where memories lived in every frame. They wanted her family to feel unsafe. They wanted them to feel unwanted. This wasn't just about noise complaints or parking violations. This was about erasing them. Isaiah was furious when he got home. "They're trying to push us out," he muttered, pacing the living room. "First the cops at the barbecue, now this. What's next? A fine for breathing too loud." "We have to be careful," Camille said, voice firm. "We can't give them a reason." Isaiah's eyes darkened. "They don't need a reason." He wasn't wrong. That night, a storm rolled in, rain tapping against the windows. But inside the Johnson home, another storm brewed, one that had nothing to do with the weather. Camille sat up in bed, staring at the ceiling. Isaiah slept beside her, his breathing deep and steady. But she knew sleep wouldn't come easy for her tonight, because she understood something now, something she hadn't fully grasped before. This wasn't just about them. This was a fight, and if they didn't stand their ground now, there might not be a neighborhood left for their children to belong to. Across the street, Margaret watched from her window, the rain streaking the glass. She smiled to herself, satisfied. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have predicted, was that this battle, this moment, would stretch beyond her years. Because the Johnsons weren't going anywhere, and neither was the fight. The autumn air had begun to cool the streets of Maplewood, leaves crunching underfoot as the season painted the neighborhood in shades of amber and rust. But despite the serene appearance, an invisible tension hung over the Johnson household. The morning after the latest encounter with the police, Isaiah stood outside, staring at his truck. It was exactly where he had left it, yet something about it felt off. He stepped closer, inspecting the tires, the door handles, the windshield. That's when he saw it. Deep scratches ran along the driver's side, the words barely legible but unmistakable. "Get out!" Isaiah's stomach tightened. His hands clenched into fists. "Camille," he called, his voice sharper than he intended. She appeared at the door, still in her robe, coffee mug in hand. The moment her eyes landed on the truck, the color drained from her face. A slow exhale, then a whisper. "Margaret." Isaiah nodded. They both knew. Camille took a step forward, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill. "We need to report this." Isaiah hesitated. "To who?" "The same cops that keep showing up to harass us." "What do you think they'll do?" Camille knew he was right. She hated that he was right. Instead, she pulled out her phone and took pictures. "We document everything," she said, her voice steel. "They want us scared, Isaiah. But we don't scare easy. Isaiah let out a slow breath and nodded. Damn right. Across the street, Margaret Whitmore sat on her porch, watching the Johnsons examine the truck. A cup of tea rested on the table beside her, steam curling into the crisp air. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply watched. She had spent years ensuring Maplewood remained exactly as she wanted it controlled, curated, unchanged. The Johnsons were a disruption, a threat to the quiet order she had come to expect. They had to go, and she was willing to be patient. The next few weeks passed in an easy silence. The Johnsons remained watchful, every noise in the night putting them on edge. Margaret, for her part, had grown bolder. She didn't hide her disdain anymore. She whispered to neighbors. She complained at city meetings about certain people lowering property values. She left anonymous notes in mailboxes, warning of changes that would ruin Maplewood's reputation. It was working. The Johnsons noticed the shift. The friendly nods from a few neighbors had turned into cautious glances. The small talk at the grocery store had disappeared. The invisible walls around them had grown taller. Then came the next blow. One evening, just after sunset, Isaiah was returning from work when he saw flashing lights in his driveway. His heart pounded as he pulled in behind the squad car. He'd barely had the engine off before he was stepping out. Camille stood on the porch, arms crossed, her face set in a mask of cold fury. Officer Daniels was back, standing in front of her, pad in hand. Isaiah approached with slow, measured steps. "What's this about?" Daniels barely glanced at him. "Violation notice." Isaiah exchanged a look with Camille before turning back. "Violation for what?" Daniels smirked, as if waiting for the question. "Your lawn." Isaiah blinked. "My lawn?" Daniels nodded toward the grass. "Too long. City ordinance requires lawns to be maintained. Yours is a few inches over the limit." Camille let out a bitter laugh. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious," Daniels replied. "You'll need to take care of it immediately, or you'll be fined." Isaiah stared at him, feeling the heat rise in his chest. "So, let me get this straight. You have time to come measure my damn grass, but not to investigate my truck being vandalized." Daniels just smiled. "I don't make the rules, just enforce them." The rage inside Isaiah boiled, but Camille placed a hand on his arm, a silent reminder. "Not here, not now." Daniels handed over the notice, then tipped his hat. "Have a good night." As he walked back to his car, Margaret appeared at her window, watching, ever the silent spectator. Isaiah turned, locking eyes with her through the glass. She raised her teacup in mock cheer. Isaiah's fists clenched, but Camille pulled him inside. They sat at the kitchen table, the violation notice between them. "They're trying to bleed us dry," Camille murmured. "Fines, tickets, they're setting traps." Isaiah exhaled through his nose. "They want us to leave." Camille looked at him, determination in her eyes. "Then we make it clear we're staying." Isaiah nodded. "But we're going to need help." Camille's fingers tapped against the table, her mind working. Then she pulled out her phone. "Who are you calling?" Isaiah asked. Camille met his gaze. "Someone who knows how to fight back." The next morning, Margaret was watering her plants when she spotted something new on the Johnsons' porch. A sign. Not a for sale sign like she had hoped. No, this one was different. Legal aid against discrimination. Know your rights. Margaret's lips thinned. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Margaret Whitmore stared at the sign on the Johnsons' porch, gripping the handle of her watering can so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had underestimated them. They were supposed to fold under the pressure, pack up, and leave like so many others before them. Instead, they had dug in deeper, armed with legal counsel and a fire in their eyes that told her they weren't going anywhere. She set her watering can down with a sharp clank on her porch railing and pulled out her phone. It was time to escalate. 2 nights later, the Johnsons woke to the sharp crack of glass shattering. Isaiah bolted upright in bed, his heart slamming against his ribs. "What was that?" Camille whispered. He was already moving, throwing on a shirt and hurrying toward the front of the house. As soon as he stepped into the living room, his stomach dropped. A brick lay in the middle of the floor, surrounded by shards of broken glass. Camille appeared behind him, her breath hitching as she took in the sight. She turned toward the window, her hands balling into fists. There, scrawled in red spray paint across the front of their house, were the words, "This isn't your neighborhood." Camille pressed a hand to her mouth, but Isaiah's blood boiled. Without thinking, he stormed out onto the porch. His eyes scanned the empty street, but whoever had done this was already gone. Camille followed him out. "Isaiah, stop. They want a reaction." Isaiah turned to her, his jaw tight. "We're supposed to just let this happen." "No," Camille said, her voice steel. "But we're not letting them control how we fight back, either." She pulled out her phone. "Who are you calling?" Isaiah asked. "The lawyer," she said, "and the press." By morning, word had spread. A local news crew showed up, cameras rolling as they captured the vandalism. A reporter, a young black woman named Nya Carter, stood in front of the Johnsons' house as she spoke into the microphone. "This isn't just about a single act of vandalism," she said, gesturing to the red spray-painted words still smeared across the brick. "This is about a pattern of targeted harassment. The Johnsons say this has been happening ever since they moved into this predominantly white neighborhood." Isaiah stood beside her, arms crossed. "We're not leaving," he said firmly. "This is our home." Margaret watched from her window, her face a thundercloud. This was getting out of hand. The backlash was swift. The police, now under public scrutiny, were forced to launch an official investigation. Maplewood's city council, eager to avoid accusations of discrimination, issued a statement condemning the harassment. Even some of the quieter neighbors, those who had watched in silence for too long, began murmuring their support. And then came the protest. It started small, a handful of people standing in front of the Johnsons' house, holding signs that read, "Maplewood is for everyone, and racism has no home here." Then more people came. Young activists, families, community leaders. The energy grew, the movement swelling. Margaret could barely stand to look at it. She slammed the blinds shut and paced her living room seating. How had it come to this? How had they turned this entire thing around? She picked up her phone and dialed. "We need to do something," she hissed. The voice on the other end was hesitant. "Margaret, this is getting too big. We never meant for." "I don't care what you meant," she snapped. "If we don't stop this now, this neighborhood will never be the same." That night, under the cover of darkness, the fire started. Isaiah woke to the acrid scent of smoke before he saw the flickering orange glow outside the window. "Camille," he shouted, leaping out of bed. Camille was already moving, grabbing the kids and rushing them downstairs. Isaiah threw open the front door and froze. Flames danced along the edge of their front lawn, licking toward the porch. Smoke curled into the air, thick and suffocating. Someone had thrown gasoline across the yard and set it ablaze. Isaiah grabbed the garden hose, spraying desperately at the flames as neighbors ran outside, drawn by the commotion. Some of them, to his surprise, grabbed their own hoses, working alongside him. The fire department arrived minutes later, dousing the flames before they could reach the house. By the time it was over, Isaiah stood in the yard, covered in soot, his chest heaving. He turned to Camille, who held their shaking children close. A police officer approached, not Danielle's this time, but a younger officer with dark hair and uncertain eyes. "Do you have any idea who might have done this?" Isaiah looked across the street. Margaret stood in her doorway watching. He locked eyes with her, and for the first time, she looked afraid. The next morning, Camille found something new in their yard. Not another act of vandalism, not another threat, but a single piece of paper tucked under a rock. She picked it up and read the words scrawled in shaky handwriting. "I know who did it, but I can't talk here. Meet me at the diner, 3 p.m. No name, no signature, just the meeting place." Camille's hands trembled as she turned to Isaiah. "This isn't over." Isaiah exhaled, steadying himself. "No, it's just beginning." Across the street, Margaret sat in her chair, gripping her teacup so hard she thought it might break. She had underestimated them. And now she was losing control. The clock inside Maplewood Diner ticked loudly, each second stretching into an eternity as Isaiah and Camille sat in a booth near the back. The air smelled of burnt coffee and frying bacon, but neither of them had an appetite. Camille kept her hands wrapped around her mug, more for something to do than for warmth. The note had said to be here at 3. It was now 3:07. Isaiah's knee bounced under the table. What if this is a trap? Camille didn't look up. We don't have a choice. If someone knows something, we need to hear it. Isaiah scanned the diner again. It was the usual afternoon crowd, an elderly couple near the window, a few workers on their break, and a teenage waitress chewing gum as she wiped down a counter. Then, the bell over the door jingled. A man stepped inside, his baseball cap pulled low over his face. He hesitated at the entrance, scanning the room. His gaze landed on them, and for a moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he walked over. Camille stiffened. Isaiah's hand went to his pocket, where his pocket knife rested, a habit he'd developed since the threat started. The man slid into the booth across from them. He looked over his shoulder once before finally lifting his hat. Isaiah's eyes narrowed. John Peterson, one of their neighbors, a man who had lived in Maplewood for over 20 years, a man who, until now, had barely said 2 words to them. Isaiah hadn't thought much about him before, but now John's face was drawn, his eyes darting toward the door like he expected someone to burst in at any moment. What the hell is this? Isaiah demanded. John exhaled sharply. I don't have much time, he said, voice low. I shouldn't even be here. Camille leaned forward. You left the note. John nodded. His fingers tapped anxiously against the table. I know who set the fire. Isaiah clenched his jaw. Who? John hesitated, then glanced around again before answering. It was Derek and his boys. A cold chill crawled down Isaiah's spine. Derek Whitmore, Margaret's nephew. Everyone knew Derek was trouble. He had run-ins with the law before, though he always managed to slither his way out of consequences. But arson, that was a new level. Camille's grip on her mug tightened. Are you sure? John nodded. Margaret's been talking to a few of us, trying to turn the neighborhood against you. Derek and his friends got drunk that night, said they were gonna send a message. Next thing I know, I hear sirens, and your yard's on fire. Isaiah's fists clenched. Why are you telling us this? John's face twisted with something like regret. Because it's gone too far. He exhaled, rubbing his hands down his face. Look, I don't agree with everything Margaret says. I didn't think it would turn into this. Camille's voice was ice. And yet, you still said nothing. John flinched but nodded. I know, I should have, but I am now. He leaned in. Margaret's losing control. She thought if she pushed hard enough, you'd leave. But now the press is involved. People are taking your side, and she's pissed. Derek's just making things worse. Isaiah's mind raced. This was it. Proof, a name, a lead the police couldn't ignore. John's voice dropped lower. Margaret's planning something. Camille's breath hitched. What? John shook his head. I don't know exactly, but she's meeting with some people tonight, at her house. After dark? Isaiah and Camille exchanged glances. John exhaled. If you're smart, you'll get out before it's too late. Isaiah's voice was steel. We're not leaving. John searched his face for a long moment, then nodded like he expected that answer. Then you better be ready, he muttered, because I don't think Margaret's done yet. That night, Isaiah parked his truck a few houses down from Margaret's and killed the engine. Camille shifted uneasily in the passenger seat. I still don't like this. Isaiah didn't either, but they needed to know what was coming. From their spot, they had a clear view of Margaret's house. Then, a car pulled up, and another. Soon, 5 people had entered the house, all older, all familiar. These were long-time residents, the ones who had been in Maplewood since the beginning, the ones who had the most to lose. Isaiah's gut twisted. Camille gripped his hand. This is bigger than us, isn't it? Isaiah nodded. Yeah. They sat in silence, watching. Minutes passed, then an hour. Then, finally, The front door opened again. Margaret stepped outside, her face tight with determination. She exchanged words with the others, nodding at something they said. Then, as if sensing eyes on her, she turned. Her gaze swept the street. For a moment, Isaiah swore she looked directly at them. Then she turned back and disappeared into her house. The next morning, the Johnsons woke up to something new. It wasn't another violation notice. It wasn't another attack. It was silence. Too much silence. Isaiah checked the porch. Nothing. Camille checked the yard. Nothing. But the air felt different, like something was coming. Then the phone rang. Isaiah answered. Hello. A deep voice, one he didn't recognize, spoke on the other end. You should have left when you had the chance. Click. The dial tone hummed in his ear. Isaiah's blood ran cold. Camille's voice was barely a whisper. Who was it? Isaiah's grip tightened on the phone. Trouble. Across the street, Margaret stood at her window, watching their house like a hawk. She had tried to be patient. She had tried to make them leave the easy way. But now it was time for something final. Something they couldn't ignore. Something that would end this once and for all. The sun had long set by the time Isaiah and Camille stood in front of their house, the warm glow of their porch lights casting long shadows on the grass. The events of the past few weeks had taken a toll on them, but they hadn't budged. They couldn't. Isaiah's eyes lingered on the darkened street. There was something in the air tonight, an ominous stillness. His fingers flexed at his sides, every instinct on edge. Are we doing the right thing? Camille's voice broke through the silence. Isaiah turned to her, his face hard. We're doing the only thing we can do. We've fought for this, for our place here. We're not running. A rustle came from the bushes near the corner of their yard. Isaiah's gaze snapped to the movement. He stepped forward instinctively, Camille right behind him. But no one emerged from the shadows. The sudden crunch of tires on gravel caused both of them to freeze. A black SUV rolled up slowly, the headlights briefly illuminating. The street before the car came to a stop in front of Margaret's house. Isaiah's stomach twisted. He had seen that vehicle before. It belonged to one of Margaret's associates, the same one who had been at the secret meetings. The door to the SUV swung open. Out stepped Derek Whitmore. Isaiah felt a jolt of fury surge through him. Stay here, he said to Camille, his voice low but fierce. He turned away before she could protest. Isaiah crossed the street, his footsteps quick and purposeful. He kept his distance, moving quietly in the shadows. He had to know what was going on. He stopped behind a large oak tree near Margaret's driveway. Eyes trained on Derek as the man walked toward the house. Derek paused at the door for a brief moment before knocking twice. Quickly, as though expecting someone, the door creaked open. Margaret stood there, her expression tight, her eyes scanning the darkness. Isaiah's heart thudded in his chest. This was it. Whatever was coming next, this was the moment it would unfold. Derek leaned in, whispering something Isaiah couldn't hear. Margaret nodded curtly, stepping back to let him in. The door closed behind them. Isaiah stood there for a long moment, his mind racing. He needed to act, and fast. He backed away quietly, then turned to head back toward his own house. But as he rounded the corner, a voice stopped him in his tracks. You shouldn't be here. It was John. Isaiah's breath caught. What the hell are you doing here? John's eyes darted nervously. You weren't supposed to see that. See what? Isaiah demanded, stepping closer. John glanced over his shoulder, as though checking for anyone watching. He lowered his voice. I don't know what Margaret's planning, but I heard them talking about something big, something tonight. Isaiah narrowed his eyes. What's something big? John hesitated. A last-ditch effort to drive you out. It's not just intimidation anymore, Isaiah. It's dangerous. Isaiah's mind raced. He had to get back to Camille. He couldn't let them catch her alone. But as he turned to leave, a shrill sound cut through the air, the unmistakable wail of sirens. Isaiah's heart pounded in his chest as he looked back at John. What the hell did you get us into? John's face was pale, his lips trembling. I didn't know they'd go this far. The sound of more cars pulling up filled the air. Isaiah turned and ran toward his house, his pulse racing. He reached the front porch just as Camille stepped out, her eyes wide with panic. "Isaiah, what's happening?" she asked, her voice shaking. Before he could respond, two squad cars screeched to a halt at the end of the block. Police officers spilled out, guns drawn. Isaiah's stomach twisted. "They've come for us," he muttered. Camille clutched his arm. "What do we do? They're not taking us without a fight." But just as the officers started to approach, a familiar figure stepped forward. "John." Isaiah's eyes widened. "What is he doing?" John raised his hands. "Stop," he shouted. "This isn't them. It's not what you think." The officers paused, confusion flashing across their faces. But as they looked to Margaret's house, something flickered in their eyes. Isaiah could see it now, the realization that Margaret had played them all. John sprinted toward them. "I'm sorry," he gasped. "I should have done something sooner. But they told me it would be easier if I kept quiet. But I'm not lying anymore." Before he could explain further, there was another commotion, louder this time. The front door to Margaret's house burst open, and figures rushed out, dragging a man with them. "Derek," he struggled, as they shoved him toward the waiting officers. His face was blooded, his eyes wide with fear. Margaret followed closely behind, fury in her eyes. "What's going on here?" she shouted. John stepped in front of her. "It's over, Margaret. You can't control everything anymore. Take in." Margaret screamed, pointing at Derek. "He's the one you want. He's the one who—" "Enough," one of the officers barked, cutting her off. They began to arrest Derek, and the other officers turned their attention back to Margaret, who was now visibly shaking with rage. Isaiah's breath caught in his throat. This was the moment they had been fighting for. This was the turn they'd all been waiting for. Derek was hauled away, and Margaret stood frozen in place, her eyes wide as the truth finally caught up with her. Isaiah looked at Camille. He could see the weight lifting from her shoulders, the tension that had held them in place for so long beginning to unravel. But even as the officers left with Derek in custody, Margaret's face remained hard, her gaze burning with a simmering hatred. She didn't look back at them as she turned, heading into her house. And for the first time in weeks, Isaiah finally allowed himself to breathe. The next day, the neighborhood buzzed with the news. The arrest, the truth, the end of the reign of fear Margaret had instilled for so long. Isaiah and Camille sat together on their porch, watching as their neighbors began to gather, offering support, words of encouragement. The battle wasn't over, not yet, but this was their victory. Their fight had meant something, and for the first time, they knew this was their neighborhood. If you like this story, make sure to like and subscribe. Also, in order to strengthen our community, I would like to know where you are watching from and what time you are currently watching this video.